Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of our podcast mini-series Getting to Better Together, which is sponsored by the Centre for International Development, Social Entrepreneurship and Leadership at the University of the Sunshine Coast and supported by Noosa Radio FM 101.3, and I'm your host Richard Borden. Before proceeding further, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I wonder what flashed through your minds as I spoke this last sentence. Were they simply words that were so familiar to you that you merely let them pass unhindered through your consciousness, or did they trigger some thinking or feeling or mental image about the words that they convey? What did I mean when I spoke of the word acknowledge, for instance, or the traditional custodians, or even the word land? What word for land do the Gubbi Gubbi people use in their language, and is their meaning of land the same as ours? Actually, when I say the word land, I wonder if you have the same image in your mind of land that I have in mine. What do you understand as land? And does it differ from what I understand? And to make matters even more complicated, I have different meanings of the word that are dependent on what aspect of land I'm talking about. Is it the paddock out the back, or is it the nation as a whole? This land is my land, and this land is your land, as the folk song has it. Of course, communication would be virtually impossible if we paused to reflect on these matters of meaning and language and understanding and mental images every time we said something to someone else. Somehow or another, we seem to muddle through conversations with relative ease once we have reached a certain level of language proficiency. Here are very important factors at work as we converse together, however, that get us beyond the Humpty Dumpty enigma. Whenever I use a word, said he, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. How would we be able to converse if we all held to that position? Well, this might all seem too trivial, at least on the one hand. But on the other hand, it might seem too academic to be of any consequence in the real world, yet it is anything but, as anyone who has tried to learn a second language will most certainly have discovered. To help unravel all of this today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk with someone who has a deep understanding of these matters. Dr. Levi Durbridge is a lecturer in world languages at the University of the Sunshine Coast and has been involved in language education across the secondary and tertiary sectors for more than 18 years in both Australia and Japan. His research explores how international mobility, language, contact, and technology and content intersect, and he's currently authoring a book entitled Language Learning, Social Media and Study Abroad, Multilingual Experiences of Japanese Adolescents. Welcome, Levi.
Thank you very much for that wonderful intro, Richard.
Let me start by asking you, what are the most important findings you can identify from your nearly 2 decades of researching the matter of language, and why should we pay attention to it when we consider the issue of getting to better together?
Great question. When we talk about the most important findings, there's different ways we could approach that, actually. It really depends on kind of what your fundamental understanding of language, which you eloquently talked about at the start of this podcast. So maybe I could talk about the aspect of language which has become more and more focused on, particularly since the 1990s. It's become much more of an important part of the conversation, and that's the idea of language as social action.
Uh-huh.
And what I mean by that is essentially, you may have heard people talk about things like language as a system, it's like a system of communication, or language as a tool for communication. And those ideas have been very, very dominant, I guess. They're very widespread. They're perhaps linked to research that was done around the same time computers were coming into being. And so people started thinking about the human brain and human abilities through that kind of idea of computers. Are we a computer? Do we have input, output, processor, kind of like a computer does? But there's been another whole stream of thought that has been around even prior to that, which is the idea that language is not a system, it's not a tool, it's actually an action, something we're constantly doing, and it's I guess it's a fundamental part of what makes us human, and therefore the ability to do anything together means that we need to use language.
In terms of a crude question, I guess,
Yes.
in terms of other animals,
Yes.
it is said that some animals have language, and we always talk about parrots learning stuff, and then
Sure.
the deep language of whales and so on.
Sure.
What's your perspective on that?
Sure. I'm not an expert in animal communication, so I don't want to point too much towards that. But I can say one thing about human communication, and that is that one thing that we can do as humans is create new ways and new ideas and new things. So we constantly innovating the ways that we speak. And part of what language can do is it's highly productive in that we can combine this kind of set finite, set of resources. It could be sounds that we're making, or there could be the written squiggles we put on a page or screen. We can combine it in an almost infinite number of ways to communicate very abstract ideas. So not just concrete things like, there's a bottle here, or that apple is red, but very abstract things like religion or political ideas that we're constantly discussing. All of these we do through language as well. So we can essentially call into being these abstract ideas through language. So I think one of the things that sets us apart is that ability to call into being abstract ideas, and then the productive sense of being able to combine infinite things together. And then the third point being to create you can see in the pandemic that we just had, we created new words and new ideas to discuss things that we hadn't really had before. Social distancing. Talk about COVID. Those types of words 5 years ago, if you'd said that to anyone, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about, or they might have had a different social distancing. Isn't that like standing away from someone because you don't like them or something like that? Right. I don't know. But now when we talk about it, everybody understands those concepts, at least in English-speaking world. So you can see we're constantly doing that, creating new ways of talking about things that perhaps are not readily apparent in front of us.
Does language change us as we mature and we become more conscious of the fact that we actually have a language, particularly when we hear another language which you obviously don't understand?
Does it change us? Yes, definitely does. Language is a huge part of our identity. We are constantly, when we speak to other people, we're constantly using language to kind of say who we want them to see us as.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so, like, I'm speaking to you right now, and I'm trying to present myself as a knowledgeable academic person who has a lot of things.
Succeeding quite well.
Trying, yes, but I'm speaking in a certain way to create that impression.
Yeah.
If, for example, I was suddenly at home, I needed someone to come around and do some work on the house, I would speak in a very different way, potentially because I wouldn't be able to put on an academic persona in that particular situation.
Yeah.
I'd want to put on a little bit more of a localized kind of like, I need some help with, hey, excuse me, mate, can you come and have a look at this, the fence down the back? I think it's coming down a bit. I need to get prepared, switching, I'd immediately switch to another register of speaking to do that.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of presenting, an identity constantly, and you do it even with people in different contexts. So if we were to go out for a drink after this, we might speak in a little bit of a different, more relaxed or informal way with each other as opposed to this setting. And so you say, what about other languages? Well, once you start moving across cultural and linguistic borders, then we need to present ourselves in different ways. It gets a little bit complex as soon as we dig into it, but we do need to essentially adopt a new identity and create a hybrid type of identity in those spaces. Yes.
I often tell the story of when I moved to work in Latin America, being able to speak Spanish at that stage, with 3 young children, really young, 6, 4, and 2. And we arrived and we were in a duplex. And we walked in the duplex, and my kids ran out into the garden. And right next door, there were 2 little kids roughly the same age, and they waved their arms and said, hola. And my kids did exactly the same thing in response. They didn't just say hello, they said hola, and they waved their arms. And I thought, isn't that extraordinary? My children have just learned how to speak the second language.
Yeah, indeed. And that's the, that reciprocity of like, I'm going to respond to what someone said in the same way that they've said to me, to kind of generate a positive social effect or social feeling between us. If they'd responded with hello, it might have been received positively as well, or it might have been received differently. And anybody who's traveled overseas or even into a different speaking area with people who are speaking different, or even visited families, who maybe have a different linguistic background, will know that when you move into somebody else's area where you feel like a stranger or an outsider, we often want to try and accommodate to that culture to not stand out and be seen as, well, not everybody, of course, but, a lot of us do, and that's one way of doing it, to reciprocate.
The intrigue for me was not just the word, but also the gesture. You can't say hola without moving your arms. And I was watching a French guy on television with the sound turned down the other day, and it was obviously French. His shoulders were moving all the time. It's just has to be the way we speak French.
Yeah. And we can talk about that idea of like how, a certain cultural milieu or a certain cultural context, that it's not just words, it's the whole body. It's a lived in, it's becoming something else to essentially communicate and be a member of and participate in that community.
Yes. Is that what's captured by the word languaging? The idea that language is a sort of dynamic?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, totally. Yes. So when we talk about languaging, we're seeing language as I said before, a social action. It's not something that's independent of us. It's something that we're constantly doing. So we could say using language, but it's still that abstracts it. It makes it sort of a tool-like thing. So the word languaging, as you say.
Nice verb.
Yes, it's a nice verb. It's what we're constantly doing. We're constantly, even right now, we're languaging with each other. And part of that languaging is also that sense of trying to be something as well.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's the enigma of Humpty Dumpty, isn't it? That there's no conversation. It's when I say a word, that's speaking. That's not languaging. It's not creating a connection with you, except that you would then argue.
Yeah, and I think too, and the importance of, languaging and using language. If I talk about using language versus languaging creates a different image in our minds than using language. So that's the real important part of language as well.
Yeah.
As you spoke in the introduction about the images that come into our mind, the ideas that it constructs when we speak.
Let me change gear a little bit now. You've spent an enormous amount of time in Japan. You're a fluent Japanese speaker. You're married to a Japanese. Are you in any way Japanese?
Well, that's great question. I would say I have an identity in Japanese. The identity of being Japanese in itself is a very complex kind of idea. It's tied up with not only language, but ideas of descendancy and heritage, of ethnicity, of nationality. And so for me to give you a simple answer, I would not call myself Japanese. But I would say I have a Japanese identity in the sense of the language. So I can interact. I use Japanese as my home language.
Wow.
If I go to Japan, I have a lot of Japanese friends, and so spend time in those communities. I can recall one instance of I took a group of Japanese high school students. I was a high school teacher in Japan for some time. I brought a group of Japanese high school students to Melbourne for a study abroad for a couple of weeks. And it was funny, actually, when we were returning to Japan, we'd been together for the whole 2 weeks, and I'd been using Japanese with them the whole time because everything else was in English there. I'd been their only teacher that was with them. And we came back to the passport gates to re-enter Japan, and I had to tell all the students, okay, well, you go to the Japanese passport section, and I need to go over here and go through the non-Japanese. And they were like, oh, that's right, you're not Japanese.
How splendid.
Yeah. So even though we'd been in Australia, because we'd constantly languaging in Japanese with each other. Yes. Yeah. So in that sense, I think, you can come to be seen as Japanese, but visually, of course, I'm a white guy, so, and I don't have a passport, and so that identity of being Japanese is perhaps contested.
Do you dream in Japanese?
Sometimes, yes, I do. Yes, I do. When I have time to dream, now I have small children, I don't get to dream that much these days, unfortunately, but yes, I do. And I dream both, cross languages as well.
Right. Have a conversation with yourself in different languages. That'd be fascinating.
Yeah. Yes. If sometimes it's the only person who is willing to listen to what you've got to say is yourself, right?
That's right. Are your children bilingual?
They are. Yes, they are. They're very determined to make me speak in English to them at the moment.
Oh, yes, understandable.
It's a constant battle where I get spoken to by them in English and I respond in Japanese.
This is an interesting phenomenon, isn't it?
Yes. Well, they're surrounded by English here in Australia, so and they understand I can speak English as well, so they constantly want me to speak because it is a little bit more of an effort for them at the moment because they're more accustomed to talk. They can talk about a wider range of topics, and they can.
In English?
Yes, because they've been here since 2017.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're still quite small and been here for quite a few years. So, all their friends speak. They go to Japanese school on the weekend, but apart from that, all of their friends speak English constantly. So,
to the language itself, are there things in Japanese that you really can't translate into English, but which are really important?
Yeah. There's this idea that things are untranslatable. Of course, you can always translate a concept, but in terms of like difficulty of like communicating, I think sometimes terms like yoroshiku is a common expression in Japanese. That's a lot harder to. Because of it, it takes the place of. It does something in concept we don't do in English, and that's why it's hard to communicate.
Okay.
So, yoroshiku, if I'm going to translate, it's like, can you favor me in this? I need you to help me with this, or I need your future kind of favor for this thing. But it's almost a formality in some instances as well. So we use it at the end of emails when we're asking people a favor, for example. We use it when we're meeting people for the first time, for example. So that's not something we often do. In English, we don't normally say, and when we're meeting them, and I ask you to, please favour this relationship moving forward. So it's not something we often do. So that, in that sense, I guess there are those kind of untranslatable things in that sense, but, I think I just translated it. So.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. But, flip it around the other way, and in English we have things like saying bless you after you sneeze, and you don't say anything after you sneeze in Japanese, or to anybody. So, in that sense, like, how do you translate "bless you" into Japanese? Just explain what it does.
Right.
There's not a word that's in the same place. Same kind of deal.
I remember the difficulties that the French got into. I had a fair bit to do with the French a while back, and because of their concern about preserving French as a language, they were prohibited, seemingly, almost by a law. It said, you can't use English words. So they got this ridiculous situation of saying English words with a French accent. It was sort of cool as saying good morning, how are you?
I'm not an expert on the French context, so I can't speak to that.
In Japanese, are there words that they have to use in English?
Well, see, the thing is, so just, particularly since the Second World War, America has had a lot of influence in Japan, and so now there's a lot of language in Japan. I think, there's a lot of it always been, just like in English, we're constantly importing language, or language moves across those kind of linguistic borders. And now I think it's something like 90% of the words recognizable to Japanese as being not Japanese words are actually English words. So words like computer is computer, hacker is a hacker. Yes. So, those types of things, hamburger, those words that have come mainly from American, and a lot of words around computing and those technologies. But, you have to go back a little bit into medical technology. You got a lot of German words because, German medical technology was something that was imported into Japan, during that period, before the Second World War. So you go back further, you find a lot of Portuguese words because the Portuguese had a lot of trade contact with Japan. So it's really about those relationships and those words coming across and who is kind of driving the kind of newer technologies that need language to go with this. But there's a little bit of a movement in Japan, a conservative movement to have Japanese style words for those concepts, but
one of the interesting things that I worked in the United States for quite a long time, and I always find it interesting now when I'm corresponding and communicating with my American friends, when I say, how are you doing, compared to how are you going in Australia. And that sort of sums up the cultural differences between the two. We're fair go and nice and easy, relaxed. In America, it's doing. We've got to keep at it.
And you can find a lot of those, especially, as I say, around those kind of rituals that we have, those communicative rituals. I think that's a really interesting space to look at and trying to understand what's going on. So how you're doing versus how you're going. There's a great article, it was 1992, a guy called, a person called Beale, did a study on a French company in Australia. And a lot of the Australian staff said, how was your weekend? And that's something we say in Australia, on a Monday morning, how's your weekend? But you're not looking for someone to give you a detailed rundown of your weekend. You're just looking for, what would you say? How was your weekend?
Great.
Yeah, exactly. So, that kind of response. But the French would understood it as, this person's really interested.
Yeah,
so let me give a detailed explanation. And then it led to these ideas of the Australians perceiving their French co-workers as incredibly conceited and self-interested. They give us this huge deal. But then the French saw the Australians as being I guess, very insincere.
Yes, disinterested, really.
Yeah, because they'd ask this question and then they'd look bored
right.
and try to get away as soon as they started telling them.
So people say, how are you? Don't answer that.
So that's a really, those kinds of rituals are a really interesting part of that kind of cross-cultural, intercultural, interlanguage kind of dynamic.
So bringing it right back to our theme,
yes.
If we are to really get to better by being together, how do we get over all these seeming hurdles? Do we just, as I suggested, let it all happen and muddle through? Or do we work at it?
Well, we definitely need to work at it. And, it depends on the context we're talking about, of course, but we definitely need to work at this. We need to develop a greater kind of understanding, intercultural understanding of the way that these things work, and move away from the ideas that the way we have of doing things is the correct way or the only way of doing these things. And I think that's kind of where we get tripped up a little bit.
Right.
I think particularly in Australia, and I don't speak to the whole of Australia, but I think there are parts of Australia where a lot of, the people that we meet in a daily, day-to-day basis have very similar backgrounds to us. And so we kind of get in a little bubble, so to speak, where, and maybe if we've lived in that bubble for quite a long time, it can seem like that is the main way of doing things. But we definitely need to step outside those kinds of bubbles. If we're going to be getting together, then we need to, step outside. And I think learning language is a great way to do that, because suddenly you're confronted with all these different ways of languaging, of being in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you're immediately asked to reconsider a lot of those ideas. Like, as I said, just even simple things like when you sneeze, saying bless you, like it becomes almost automatic. But what are we actually doing there? Why is that? We know why we do that. But, and then what does it say about us? And, is that always the norm? Is there other ways of doing that kind of thing? And then we can take that a step further and we can look at, when we start learning a language too, we also become, I guess, a little bit empathetic towards a lot of people who come the other way. Yeah. Need to, they come to, our communities and need to find a way to be and participate in our communities. That can be really hard. And we might not recognize it because we've been doing it since we were children, essentially.
It's actually one of the first phrases. I had to go at a number of different languages at various stages of my life. And one of the first phrases you learn is how do you say that in their language, don't you?
Yes.
But you don't actually say what you mean by that. You just simply say, how do you say that?
Yes.
So really seeking the word rather than the whole notion of the word it's trying to convey.
Yeah, indeed. And, I think if I've understood what you're talking about here correctly, I think that, there's that dictionary idea of like, a word, has a sudden, immediate translation across another language. But even if it does, what is the context that it's used in? What are the other meanings? And you talked about the idea of land at the start. I thought it was a really kind of great illustration of that point, exactly what we're talking about. Like that idea of land can have so many different connotations. Depends on the context that it's used and depends on the person who's using it. Yeah. So I think that's a brilliant example of what we're talking about.
Again, as anyone who's tried to use a phrase book would quickly learn.
Indeed. Great example.
Levi, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. I hope the listeners have too, and I'm sure they have. I hope you can come back at some later stage and we'll talk further.
We'd love to, Richard. And can I just say what a fascinating and amazing concept this is? I really kind of connect with your idea of getting to better together. That idea that there isn't a perfect, there isn't an ideal. That we shouldn't be trying to attain an ideal. We should be looking to be better. I really like that concept, and I think this is a fantastic podcast. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just end on that note that you've just raised the thing that I heard a 9-year-old child the other day saying, if there is nothing perfect, why is there a word for it? I'll leave you with that thought. And to you all for listening, thank you so much, and I look forward to the next time we meet. Until then, goodbye.